Good afternoon, everyone. I am Larry Pulley. I'm privileged to be the Dean of William & Mary's Raymond A. Mason School of Business. My wife is here right on time. That's excellent. This is a terrific turnout. Thank you. And there are doubtless many people stuck in traffic somewhere. It is Northern Virginia, so I'm sure people will be joining us as we move forward. The first thing I want to do is thank our gracious host, Mr. Todd Stottlemyre, and the Innova team who are with us today. Thank you for providing this wonderful venue for us. Todd, as you know, is CEO of the Innova Center for Personalized Health. He also has another full-time director of the Board of Visitors of the College of William & Mary, and he and his other members of the Board of Visitors are doing a magnificent job in leading the college these days, so thank them. Thank him and thank everyone for being here in this wonderful conference center. You know, this event highlights two initiatives at the center of what we are focusing on in the business school, the College of William & Mary, Healthcare and Analytics. I'm delighted to say that we launched our Master of Science in Business Analytics program this past August. The first class will graduate. We were late in the admissions process. We thought maybe we'd get 20 or 25 students. We have 47 in the inaugural class. There are still hiring opportunities available for those of you that are interested. We have this year 10 times as many applications. We will double the size of the program to 2 sections of 45, and we are going to launch an online version of our Master of Science in Business Analytics program in August of 2018. This event is jointly sponsored by our wonderful Business Analytics Advisory Board and the Washington Area Alumni Business Alliance, WABA. The Analytics Board, you know, one of the things we do is bring business into the business school for our students. And the Analytics Board is helping us make sure that our Business Analytics program is providing the students everything they need to succeed from day one and ongoing. The William & Mary Alumni Business Alliance, WABA, as many of you know, is led by alumni who are focused on engaging alumni in the Northern Virginia area, in networking and opportunities that enhance their own development, and also in initiatives that help provide career internship and career opportunities for our students. Both of these groups are helping us be the business school that is leading all business schools in getting alumni companies working together with our faculty and program staff to make sure our students are truly career ready and to connect them to world-class opportunities. So thank you for that. And now let me introduce the moderator of our panel, Professor Rajiv Kohli. Rajiv has just been recognized for the second year as the #1 researcher in the world in healthcare informatics. That is a remarkable accomplishment. Every day I have to bring a big stick into my office to beat off all the other schools that are trying to recruit him to go there. Now, a lot of schools would do that with a big pot of money given to Rajiv, so we're William & Mary, we use a big stick.
And it works.
Rajiv, thank you for everything you do, and please, come by.
Thank you, Larry, for that exaggerated introduction.
All true.
It's a pleasure to be here and to see some of my students here, third students, past students, and to meet new friends. I'm delighted at the turnout. And as Larry said, some of our friends might still be joining us in a few minutes. So looking forward to that. We have a very distinguished panel here. I've had a chance to speak with each of them, and we'll get started in a minute. So the topic today is leading the business of analytics. I remember the time when we used to complain that there isn't enough data out there. Give us more data. And so we started collecting all kinds of data. And then we said, what does it mean? So we started processing that. We call that information. But now data is coming at such high speed and from such micro sources that we are collecting a lot of dots, but we can't connect those dots and make meaning out of them. So I'll start with a very brief example before I go to my panel. I recently got an email from my water utility service in Williamsburg that said, "We think you have a water leak in your house." I was like, "Yes? How do you know?" So well, we have this report that we can send to you. I said, "Yeah, please, here's my email address." They sent me a 64-page long report in which they had hourly consumption of water for the last 3 months. Now, some of that I could explain because my daughter takes very long showers. She's a teenager. But there was something that was happening at 2, 3, 4 in the morning that we couldn't explain. And I said, this is too long. They said, well, we'll give you a summary report. So they sent me a one-pager in which there were these bars with red dots that indicated what time the water leak was, and there were 2 of them. This is my utility. We figured it out, fixed it, and I had a conversation with them, and they were giving this information to us for free. Now, people told me don't give them ideas because they'll increase our taxes. But that makes us think that if a utility can do this and collect all this data and analyze it and contact me and let me know there is a water leak in your house, we ought to be able to do much more in healthcare, where there's so much data that is coming our way. And now with the wearable devices, people are collecting more and sending more data. Now, the big challenge is, what do we do with that data? And who do we provide that data to make changes in what they do? So let me start with introducing our panelists. I'll start from the far end. We have Ed Coleman, class of 73, CEO of Ciox. We have Ann McGeorge, class of 83, partner in Grant Thornton. Then we have Todd Stallmeyer, class of 85, CEO of Innova Center for Personalized Health. This is where the action is going to be with a lot of the data analytics that we talked about. And finally, we have Krista Johnson, 92, principal with Ernst & Young. A very distinguished panel with lots of wonderful experience. So what I'll do, I'll start with Ed on the far end. Just take 2 minutes and tell us a little bit about, from your perspective, what is it that this audience should know about, and what are some of the challenges that you see as we move forward? So 2 minutes.
Okay, 2 minutes. Just a bit about Ciox. It's Ciox Health, and we're in the business of managing the exchange of clinical records across the healthcare ecosystem. And when I think about healthcare analytics, the first things that come to my mind are all the great insights that people are developing, either from a diagnostic standpoint or developing treatments or cures for cancer or whatever, based on this deep analysis of all this available healthcare data that Rajiv was talking to. I come at it from a slightly different standpoint in terms of what I do with Ciox. Our business is feeding those engines of analysis. Where do the deep thinkers, where does Watson get its data to do its analytics? And our company provides about 40 million clinical records a year to a variety of health plans, hospital networks, patients themselves, other doctors. So we're sort of the source of those records that they do their analytics on. From my standpoint, the way we apply analytics in our part of the ecosystem is how can we do a better job of finding where the right record is. We'll be told to go get 500,000 records by patient name. Where are they? Because the place where you got your care may be a different place than where you filed your claim, which is a different place where the chart might actually exist. And we don't have in our country a single unified database where you can go get those records. It's scattered all over the country. So our job is to figure out how to better find where your clinical record is in order to feed that analytics engine. And that's a data analysis problem in and of itself.
Thank you. Ann?
Excellent. I'm Ann McGeorge, and I'm the National Managing Partner for Grant Thornton's healthcare practice. So as such, I oversee healthcare services to all of our services to all of our healthcare clients, audit, tax, and advisory. So in doing so, I travel all around the country. I'm on an airplane every week, and mostly talking to our healthcare clients about their key issues affecting them, the majority of which are health systems. And not one conversation have I had probably in the last 2 years that business analytics has not come up. So it's top of mind for the healthcare industry, from the executive suite to the boardroom. And I kind of look at business analytics from the conversations I have with our clients as falling into 3 buckets. So the first bucket are kind of efficiency types of analytics, maybe accounting, finance, operational efficiencies. How do we make this system run more efficiently in terms of our back office operations, our HR, our staffing, et cetera? And a lot of that is still in a fragmented state. I will say that the health systems around the country are all over the board. So the good news is there's lots of opportunity for healthcare consultants. I tell our team we have job security probably for the next couple of decades, especially as healthcare continues to change. The second bucket, I think, is more clinical and clinical efficiencies with regard to data analytics. I think Todd will speak to that. With the specifics into like predictive analytics and how do we truly improve people's health through analytics. And then the third bucket is kind of a combination of both. How do we use analytics to not only create efficiencies within our system and in the ways we deliver healthcare, but that also have clinical components as well. Take, for example, creating a clinical efficiency in how an orthopedic practice buys and puts in knee replacements. And so we recently had a client that went through this exercise, and just by having a conversation among the various orthopedic surgeons in their system, they were able to come up with a standardized process and a standardized type of replacement just for knees that saved the system over $3.5 million a year. And that's just one tiny little example of how the analytics associated with a clinical efficiency can drive costs down in healthcare. So lots of opportunity for analytics. Probably the biggest challenge, as I think everyone on the panel will mention, is just organizing the data and getting it into a subset that is usable to make these very important decisions.
Thank you, Ann. Todd?
Well, since I'm the host, maybe a couple prerogative comments. First of all, I'm amazed that you're all here. And on a Thursday night talking about analytics, and I told Ed Coleman that. He said, you're probably all of my employees that showed up or something like that. And I said, no, I think we promised them that they get into William & Mary, either their kids or grandkids or something like that. So it's great to see everybody tonight. Couple just quick comments before I address the question. I just want to recognize Larry Pulley. We really have an outstanding dean of the business school, and his real foresight in the business analytics area in developing this program. And we had a chance to chat last week, and I just want to say really thank you for your great leadership on behalf of the university, the college. Also, I have a colleague here with me tonight, Lynn Dillon, who's a member of the Board of Visitors. I've given her one of the toughest jobs. She chairs the Academic Affairs Committee on the Board of Visitors, and that's not an easy job when you have very strongly opinionated faculty, great faculty, but she just does a magnificent job. So it's great to see Lynn here tonight as well. So, in terms of data and healthcare, healthcare really has spent the last several years focusing on 2 things. First, on this whole issue of digitization of health records. Electronic medical records, electronic health records, trying to make the pipes work, the basic workflow, and digitize electronic records. And that's been certainly a big focus over the last several years. The other focus now is on security. And healthcare is absolutely freaked out about security. Because when we architected all that interoperability and that architecture around digitization of records, we basically said if you come in the front door, you can get into the entire house. And so the architecture was probably not done in the best way when you think about security. So interoperability, digitization of records, lots of healthcare data, big focus. To me, that's interesting, but not nearly as exciting as the opportunity that lays ahead, and that's really around data analytics. And the ability to take data from many, many sources, and not just health data. I mean, historically, healthcare would think about what we call genotypic and phenotypic data, and bringing that data together and trying to have actionable outcomes. But it's much more than just phenotypic and genotypic information. There's lots of information out there that's very relevant about your health. And so the ability to take that data, and data is interesting, but to me data is really not relevant because you're really trying to take data from lots of sources and turn it into actionable information. We're trying to make that information actionable to improve health outcomes, to improve quality, and also reduce cost. And I had a speech last night, and I said, I think we're just, if you like baseball, we're just in the top of the first inning in terms of the opportunity around predictive analytics, to be able to better predict and prevent disease, to be able to better predict and prevent certain outcomes, and the ability to impact quality outcomes and ultimately cost of healthcare. So to me, it's an exciting area. Technology and analytics are foundational to everything that we're doing here in the Inova Center for Personalized Health. In fact, I was on a panel not too long ago with the Dr. Eric Green, who runs the NIH National Human Genome Research Institute. He was on the team that mapped the human genome. That concluded in 2003. And he'll say, you know what, medicine's great, science is great, but without the power of technology, high performance computing, storage capacity, and analytics, we wouldn't be where we are today. And most importantly, the opportunity ahead is very significant because of the power of technology, the power of analytics. So I think we're just, again, in the top of the first inning in a very exciting game to play ahead that fundamentally impacts the human condition.
Thank you.
You mentioned baseball, Todd. I thought for sure you were going to make a Moneyball joke, but I'm sure everyone appreciates that you did. My name is Christopher Johnson with EY. I'm a partner who leads our healthcare analytics practice. I've been doing advanced analytics across a wide range of industries for about 24 years and developed over the course of the last 5 or 6 years specifically a passion for focused on analytics, which is why I'm now focused in that industry. As an EY partner, I also feel I should start by saying, just to remind everybody, we tabulate the results for the Golden Globes and the Emmys, not the Oscars, but I'll leave it at that. I have to get that off my chest every time, sorry. There's a lot of things that we do in healthcare analytics I think that have been addressed. I think the area where I'm personally spending some time, and a lot of my clients are becoming more and more interested, and many clients, both providers and payers, are actually starting to change their hiring practices to look at that, which is to actually leverage skills for influencing customer behavior from other industries. As many of you might know, Aetna recently hired the head of analytics from Harrah's, the gambling website, because he knows how to influence customer behavior. Many of my clients are hiring people from a wide range of industries. And so one of the things that I spend a lot of my time helping clients with is really helping them understand a wide range of analytical techniques and the types of decisions that you can use analytics to support that will influence customer or patient behavior, because there's a whole lot of insights you can gain on the clinical side, but a lot of those clinical insights require a behavior change. And so there's many techniques where some payers are developing new mobile applications to actually really get engaged with the customers. And for those mobile applications, there's a lot of analytics that you need to leverage big data to do things like, how do you increase the percentage of customers who actually download that mobile app once you create it? And then once they download that mobile app, if you have certain instructions or interventions or things you want them to do differently, how do you actually monitor based on defined clickstream information of what they're clicking through on your website and that mobile app, and how you actually use that to develop better messaging, more proactive interventions to really drive that behavior. And I'll just give you one quick example. I'll turn it back over to you. I was recently talking with a payer who's focused on reducing the problem with opioid abuse. And one of the things that a lot of the analytics around opioid abuse is focused on, once somebody's addicted or overdosed, how do you actually prevent a death? Well, what they've found is that if you look at not just the medical information, but a lot of the behavioral information that's happening with these customers, they have now a predictive model that identifies certain people who have been prescribed opiates that are highly at risk of addiction. and they're actually proactively reaching out and talking to these people, offering them services before they've been identified in any system as having an addiction problem. And they're amazed at the engagement of these people when they get a proactive phone call, how willingly, the percentage of times they actually volunteer and start to participate and engage in programs to predict, to prevent addiction is an example of how you can really start to leverage some of these big data and analytics techniques to affect behavior in a way that ultimately improves healthcare outcomes and lowers costs.
Thank you, sir. We've heard some wonderful examples of what's on the horizon and what we see as opportunities. So what we'll do is I'll start with some questions that I have for the panelists. We will take questions from the audience a little bit later, say at the top of the hour. There are some index cards on your tables with some pens. Feel free to take questions, write down questions. If you are shy and want to not raise your hand, you can do that. Or when we open up for questions, please ask questions. So let me start with Ed. Ed, there are a lot of people here who are entrepreneurs. We train entrepreneurs with statistical backgrounds, with programming backgrounds, analytic backgrounds. So some of the transformation projects that you've undertaken and some of the challenges that you described earlier, what are some of the entrepreneurial opportunities for them that may think about as they go forward?
Well, certainly, a lot of exciting things have been touched on in terms of what you could do to improve outcomes. And I think there's rightfully so, there's a lot of energy around that. As I was describing, though, I think there's also a lot of opportunity around sort of the basic plumbing of the healthcare infrastructure. Todd was talking about the interoperability that's been put in place, all the money that's gone into EMRs and EHRs, and yet with all that, trying to get your record from one healthcare system to another healthcare system is not a liquid transaction. There's a lot of labor and human intervention to do that. So the business I'm with is actually the aggregation of 3 different entrepreneurs came together, funded by a private equity firm, to try and begin to address this problem in a more technology-enabled way. But interoperability is a huge area, I think, where there's still an awful lot of work to be done and entrepreneurial opportunities to be had. But again, I'm looking at it, healthcare almost as a logistics business, a supply chain business of healthcare information, as opposed to a clinical basis. So I think you can look at it from what can I do to solve, cure something, have better outcomes. You can also think about it in terms of what can I do to facilitate all that occurring. I'm a back office guy.
Thank you.
I'm a back office guy.
But very critical part of moving information that is eventually needed for analytics. So Anne, from your perspective, we've heard from the panelists earlier as well the issue of security and privacy and so on. We know Todd's working on state-of-the-art personalized medicine. What kind of issues should he be aware of about security and privacy and all of those issues?
Well, that's a great question. And if I can, I just want to answer his question too,
Please.
Just because it's already been asked. But I just attended the JP Morgan Investors Conference, which is the largest healthcare investors conference, and it's held every year in January, 40,000 people. And just listening to some of the presentations from the entrepreneurs on these new technologies are just, they're amazing. And some of them will make it, most of them will not. I mean, things from bed sheets that take all your vital signs to iPads that have risk assessments while you're sitting into a doctor's office, to everything in between. So just some really fascinating technology that, as you kind of think about the continuum of healthcare, and even using your own personal experiences in dealing with either your parents or your loved ones or yourself through the health system, people are finding little niches of unmet areas within the healthcare delivery model, and those are the niches that are going to ultimately end up being the ideas that'll that'll blossom. We have a client that is setting up birthing centers for low-risk births, and they're contracting with the hospitals for these very nice birthing centers, and the cost of having a baby, if it's a low risk in one of these birthing centers, is a fraction of having a baby in the hospital, just to try to lower the cost, and it's a better experience for these younger, low-risk pregnancies. So just ideas like that. But back to the question about risk, and it's a great question because there is, when you think about cybersecurity and you just think about how health information can be breached, most people feel that health information is probably more valuable than financial information when you get down to all the things you can do with health information. And that's a topic that comes up with our clients all of the time. When you think that there's close to 40,000 apps out there that have to do with healthcare and communication between providers, physicians, and patients, how do you keep all that data secure? And then the discussion we got in earlier about who's liable for the data if there's an unfavorable outcome from a wearable device, for example, that gets transmitted to the physician, and then what if it's not acted on? So there's a huge issue with regard to data privacy and even the liability associated with all this transfer of data. So it's going to be a challenge in terms of dealing with this. From the privacy, just the patient privacy perspective, it's a top of mind issue for all of the health systems. How do we protect this data so that it doesn't get outside of the realm of the environment that we want it to be used in? So I don't have the answer. I just can expand on the fact that it is a big problem.
Thank you. So for those of you who are interested in security, blockchain technologies, for instance, here are some opportunities to find ways to secure exchange of information. So a question for Todd. Todd, you're working with something that requires very serious horsepower of processing, personalized medicine. So recently there was a story in Wall Street Journal that MD Anderson, that had been using IBM Watson, the much storied IBM Watson, has decided to discontinue that project. Now they were very quick to point out it's not because of any weakness of IBM Watson, but it's just that it requires so much investment and infrastructure, and they were not seeing the value, at least not yet. So from your perspective, what advice would you give to businesses that are considering analytics as part of their core competency?
Well, again, I think, as I said, I think we're in the top of the first inning. I think it's very early. I also think healthcare was a late adopter of both information technology as well as analytics. So we're late to the game and we're early in the game. So I think it's an interesting juxtaposition. But when you think about analytics, I mean, you think about some simple applications. You heard bed sheets. Well, what's in a bed sheet? It's a sensor, right? It's sensor technology. What can that tell you? What's one of the biggest challenges in a hospital? Falls. Patients that actually get out of their bed and they fall. Huge issue. Right, but a sensor could actually tell if somebody's still in their bed or out of the bed, and you could prevent falls, and that's a huge issue inside a hospital. Sensor technology around a cardio patient, somebody who's had an acute cardio condition, they've been released from the hospital, they want that 24/7 type of monitoring, remote monitoring with an EICU or E something that's monitoring them on a 24/7 basis. Again, the power of sensor technology. Colonoscopies, not everybody's old enough to have had a colonoscopy, I can see in the room here, but some of us have. And a colonoscopy is an invasive procedure. It usually knocks out about 2 days. But think about sensors, and a sensor actually going through the large intestine, your colon, and actually determining whether or not you should have an invasive procedure. So sensor technology, I think, is one of the most exciting areas because it's going to generate, it's also going to generate a lot of data. And you know, think about patches on the arm. Under Armour, right? Everybody knows Under Armour. What does Under Armour do? They make shirts, they make clothing, right? They're investing a lot of money in healthcare, a lot of money in sensors because they want to make those dumb shirts smart shirts. And the data that comes out of that, right? And so what do you take that is? So, you know, I think, again, we're very early. I think sometimes we look for the unicorn around analytics. You know, what's the unicorn? We can cure a disease based on analytics. I don't think the unicorn's there. I think it's fundamentally expanding our view in terms of the sources of data. As I mentioned earlier, it's not just the typical phenotypic, genotypic data. It's data beyond the healthcare institution, then how you bring that data together and make it actionable. And that data is going to be generated in many places. It's going to be out of hospitals, healthcare institutions, it's going to be based on sensor technology. And then how do you bring all that data, how do you fuse that data and turn it into actionable information that you can better, hopefully, predict and prevent disease, falls, events, and also use it in a way to improve outcomes quality as well. So again, I think we're very, very early. I think this has a long story. So from an entrepreneurship standpoint, I think huge opportunities ahead.
So just follow up on the advice that I was asking for the audience. You mentioned predict and then prevent, but there's a real issue that you as a provider are also looking to be more effective, which means it will reduce the demand for services.
Yep.
So how do you balance something that you are going to invest a lot in today and also see a loss in revenue?
So this center is called the Center for Personalized Health for a very specific reason. The common vernacular is personalized medicine or precision medicine, and that's a component of our vision, but it's health intentionally because we view that as a large healthcare system that fundamentally our job is to help keep healthy people healthy in the first place. Now, the economic system in healthcare, that's not the economic reward system today. The economic reward system in healthcare is fee for service. The more you do, the more you get paid. But we really believe that we're going to move to a fee for value type of system where the economics are going to move and we're going to be paid better based on how well we keep you healthy as opposed to just being sick. And so this whole campus, and precision medicine is a component of our personalized health vision, but this whole campus is fundamentally focused on health. And how do we move away from what's a transactional relationship today where you come into a hospital, you have a transaction, and then you leave, to actually engage in your health longitudinally from birth until death. And not just you as an individual, but also engaging you and your family, because we know that disease actually presents in families, not just individuals. And so we want to be able to use the power of analytics, the power of data, the power of information to help you take health actions to keep you healthy in the first place. We believe not only that's the right thing to do, but we also believe that's where the healthcare system's going to go. It's not there yet, but that's where we think it's going to go.
Thank you. So question for you, Krister. I like the example that you gave working with your clients. So you go and advise clients on how to use analytics and what to do with it. So what advice would you give to the audience here who may be considering analytics on the skill set that they have to develop to take your advice and implement it?
Yep. So there's generally three categories of skill sets we talk about. There's the math, the actual analytics, how to build analytics models. Then there's the technology, which gets on the data side. We've talked a lot about it could be sensors and how to leverage that. And then, but there's also the business side. So math, technology, and business. In some form or the fashion, you've got to create teams that have all three. We sometimes joke that we call that the suits, the nerds, and the geeks, but you don't have to use those terminologies if you don't want to. But ultimately, what it boils down to is when you create a team to go solve any problem, raise your hand if you ever heard somebody, analytics is about asking the right questions. Raise your hand if you've heard that. Okay, so a lot of people have. Actually, what we found when we really get into helping our clients create value is that the right questions only get you so far. What really becomes important is understanding the analytics value chain. And what the analytics value chain is if you start with managing data, you then have to perform some analytics, but then you have to actually, to get that value, you have to drive a decision or you have to drive an action. And so when you think of asking questions, you need to make sure that you're also thinking in the context of, if I answer that question, how am I going to take an action and what is the decision going to be? If you're developing analytics for strategic purposes, it's a little bit easier because you can actually do the more traditional, I do some analysis, I develop an observation, and then I share it with people. But more and more, and the things leveraging the sensors and what we've been talking about up here, where the value is actually embedding smart algorithms into real-time operational decisions that not only will actually recommend an action, but also actually then collect additional sensor information or other information from different systems to then do self-learning and actually improve itself. Not necessarily Watson cognitive intelligence, that's a whole nother level, but just literally setting up the algorithms in a way where on a nightly basis the models are rerun using new data to figure out what is common. In a lot of cases, what we find as I work with clients, especially in the payer side, is that the effectiveness of interventions, an intervention being, hey, we're going to proactively reach out and call somebody. What really drives the effectiveness of that more so than anything else is the amount of time between when some bit of data was created or some event happened and when you reach out to that person. So a lot of the analytics, as you start to think of skill sets, you really have to think about how can I actually focus on reducing that time between when there's some data out there, either on social media or a wide range of different systems. How can I figure out algorithms to operate in a way that identifies that and gives me insight so I can take an action and communicate with the customer in an amount of time that really does impact something. So I went a little bit beyond just the skill sets, but I think this notion of really thinking about how can analytics be embedded into real-time decision-making and operational systems is really, really important.
Thank you. And the great segue to my next question for Todd. You heard about the importance of taking action and changing behaviors. When you come out with some learning from personalized medicine, you will have to take that to physicians and other clinicians that will require them to change their behaviors. What kind of experience are you having with that?
Well, it's not, particularly in the genetic side, genomic side, most physicians will tell you that even ones that recently graduated from medical school, I mean, that's not a big topic in medical school. And so we, for example, last year, Pharmacogenomics, which is the intersection of pharmacology and genomics, where we can, with a cheek swab and a sequence, a genomic sequence, we can actually tell newborn babies and their parents and adults how certain drugs will metabolize and whether or not they will metabolize well, so you understand dosing, and also, very importantly, whether or not there's toxicity. So we started something called Medi-Map for newborns at the Unova Fairfax campus across the street as part of a standard of care that each newborn baby born at a hospital, Fairfax Hospital across the street, with an opt-in would have again, free of charge, part of the standard of care, a pharmacogenomics test. Now, that's really important because one of the drugs that we test is codeine. Codeine is a commonly given drug for pain for young children. Codeine can have multiple outcomes. It can work with no side effects, it can not work with side effects, and it can have also very, very serious side effects, including death. So that information is actionable information. Well, working with physicians who have, first of all, very little background in genetics or genomics, pediatricians and others, and almost no background in analytics, it's a challenge. I mean, it's a big challenge to be able to take data, make it actionable, and then get somebody, to your point earlier, to actually get somebody to do something different, right, whether it's a clinician or whether it's a patient. You can have the information, that information can be actionable, but you actually have to get somebody to do something different. And so it's that kind of longitudinal ability to take data, turn it into actionable information, and get a change in behavior, whether it's a clinician who's going to practice differently or a patient who's going to behave differently based on the information that they have. You know, one of the things we do with the genomics information, genetic information, is a significant investment with genetic counselors, people that can help patients in particular interpret that information so they can take the right actions related to their health. And I'll give you just one quick example, you know, how things are different. So if a mom today, 48 years old, just making this up, came in and presented with breast cancer, you know, typically what a healthcare system would do today through the power of genomics and genetics is try to understand the molecular characterization of her tumor. And so we would run a sequence. We would want to know the molecular characterization of that tumor. Well, that's just treating the person who has cancer. What if she has two daughters, you know, 22 and 24? What if her mother had breast cancer, her sister had breast cancer? How do we engage those two daughters? I mean, they would probably want to know if they have a BRCA1, BRCA2 genetic marker. And so again, that's getting two people who are healthy to actually think about the power of data, information that could be actionable, so they can now have that information and hopefully make very informed decisions that to modify potentially behavior. Could be behavior where they're going to take, you know, more action around prevention, or it could be behavior where they make a decision in some cases to have a double mastectomy to avoid having breast cancer at some point in the future. So again, you can have all the information, you can have data and information, but you got to translate that into action. And it's something that we're still working at very hard.
Thanks. Ed, you are managing the supply chain of movement of data across many partners, and we're talking about lots and lots of data. Todd just referenced the fact that there is privacy involved. You know, And when you move data, you open yourself up to bad guys. We talked about cybersecurity earlier. What kind of steps do you take to make sure that the privacy and security of that information that you're moving is maintained?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. That's sort of job number one. And it's both systems and it's people dependent. So you have to make sure that all your people are trained on what the requirements are, what HIPAA compliance requirements are. You operate your IT infrastructure and your networks at a high trust standard, which is another standard defined for the industry. And you just focus on that cybersecurity element all the time, as well as the people training element of it. And I think one of the challenges in healthcare is that it's a people-dependent business. I mean, compared to other industries that I've had experience in, like airlines or financial services or different parts of government, we are much more highly reliant on labor in the healthcare industry than we are in other industries. And that means that each individual is a potential breach or an opportunity for a breach to occur. So you really have to pay an awful lot of attention to the training of your people as well as to the IT aspects of it.
Thank you. And you consult with organizations all across the country. What is it that keeps your clients, especially those that are dealing with lots of data, up at night, and what worries them? And what advice would you have for the audience that they can make sure that they can sleep well?
Well, security is probably the number one thing with regard to data that keeps our clients up at night. Just being able to defend from breaches that could potentially get the data in the wrong hands, but also a data breach that could be a clinical data breach. And I was just having a conversation with a client in Maine about this. I mean, if it actually impaired one of their clinical systems, I mean, people die. I mean, if a system goes down, then people could die if it's a life-saving type of operation for them. So that's probably, I would say, the number one issue that keeps them up. And then second is just how to create this interoperability of the data. They've got so much of it now. Like you said, before they were trying to gather data, now they've got so much of it. How can they get it organized to be able to use it, to make it meaningful, to be able to take action on it, to actually help health outcomes? And sitting with a client about a month ago who said, we've got to be thinking about how, and then the financial side being the third, how do we do that and still make money? Yeah. So this CFO said, we've got to figure out how to make money by keeping people out of the hospital. And that's like a whole paradigm shift for the healthcare system right now.
And that was the question that I had thought you answered earlier about how do you balance that?
Rajiv, could I just add something on the security piece? I do think there's a little bit of a culture clash coming where sort of healthcare writ large really is focused on privacy and security. I think as you begin to see more of a Silicon Valley aspect to healthcare, and let's do something disruptive, I'm not sure the same sensitivity and sensibility exists in that world as exists in the traditional healthcare environment. So I think there's a little bit of a clash coming there.
So what kind of culture change would facilitate that?
Well, they've been pretty successful in Silicon Valley, so I'm not sure they think they need to change, right? But I think they'll run into some roadblocks along the way where security, privacy will become an impediment to their ability to do some of the disruptive things that they'd like to do across the healthcare system.
When it comes to security, I believe strongly in the golden rule. If you make somebody believe that their life is going to be better by giving you access to their personal data, they will give you the personal data. That's been proven over and over again across a wide range of industries. So I think to a large extent in healthcare, there is a lot of focus on security about private information. But if you start to communicate to people the value in that data, it'll become less of a problem. It doesn't mean that you have to prevent hackers from getting into your system. That's a very real issue. But I think that the golden rule is something that does apply.
Well, I just add to that too. I think when healthcare, 7, 8 years ago, when meaningful use in electronic medical records and health records, I think healthcare, we really believed that we were the hub and from the information standpoint, and the consumers were the spokes. I think we got it wrong. I think in the end, the hub is going to be the consumer, and the consumer is going to they're going to possess the data, and they're going to plug in when they go into a hospital or urgent care, and they're going to be the ones that control the data ultimately. So I think the whole thinking through the infrastructure, we always thought we build these big electronic medical record systems and we're the hub. We're going to be one of the spokes that the consumer is going to be at and I say consumer intentionally because it's not just going to be a patient. You're going back to the comment about keeping healthy people healthy. You're going to possess that data about your health, and that's going to be fed by all sorts of different types of sources, and you're going to have to protect that data because in the end, it's your health data.
Yeah, so that's called the Uberization of healthcare. We are at the top of the hour. As I had promised, I'll let you ask questions. But before I do that, I want to see if the panelists have questions for each other before we open up.
He didn't tell us about that. It's like a debate now. What do you think about it?
Well, I have one for Todd, if you don't mind.
Sure.
So obviously you're kicking off this new health, personalized health, this whole building that's not just a business. What keeps you up at night?
But how do we finance all this? No. It's interesting because I think, the view of our leadership is healthcare is going through tremendous disruption. And we're trying to be at the forefront of that. And not just in terms of, quality and outcomes, but fundamentally around the science too. And we're in an interesting position because science and technology, as you know, always runs faster than policy. Policy broadly defined, whether it's payment policy, whether it's public policy, it runs ahead of both payment policy and public policy. So we have pushed out pretty aggressively with this personalized health vision, which again includes the precision medicine component piece of this, and the ecosystem is pretty far behind us. I mean, the payment ecosystem is really far behind us. I mean, payers, the amount of experience inside payers around genetics and genomics, it's pretty thin. And you would think it's logical that if we can do a pharmacogenomics test for $200 and we can prevent you from having a severe adverse reaction to a drug that could result in hospitalization and all sorts of other things that affect your health, very, very costly, that a payer would just naturally want to reimburse for that. Not necessarily. It's very logical, right? If you've applied for life insurance recently, it's not uncommon now to see questions about, have you had genetic testing? And if you have, please tell us about it. Well, if you have genetic testing and you tell that those 22 and 24-year-old girls whose mom has breast cancer, that they have a high probability of getting breast cancer, that they may think about taking more prophylactic steps around active monitoring or beyond that, you would think that you would want them to know that and that the reimbursement system would cover that genetic test, right? Because it's going to predict better and hopefully prevent disease, or if disease happens with cancer and you get it stage 1, it's a curable disease. When it metastasizes, obviously it becomes much more problematic. But that type of test is not necessarily covered today. So the ecosystem has got to catch up, the payment ecosystem, because today when you answer that life insurance question, you say yes to genetic testing, they can decide not to write a policy just based on your answering yes. It doesn't make sense, right? We want people to take control of their health. We want to keep healthy people healthy. So that, the financing of all this and the ecosystem not being caught up to where the science is, it's got to catch up, because right now there's an incongruity, incongruity between where we are from a technology, science, medicine standpoint and where the ecosystem is. So, long answer, short question. I apologize.
I enjoyed it. It's good.
I'd like to ask Krista what's the difference between a geek and a nerd.
Krista will tell you that.
Oh, it's a very formal definition. A geek is like you see at the Geek Squad at Best Buy. They're the technology guys. The nerds are the guys who specialize in math. In the joke. It's a joke. I don't want anybody leaving here thinking I was making a serious comment there.
I have a question for you, Krista. You kind of see all sectors of healthcare, probably a broader view than mine's sort of more provider-based. Do you think that any one sector, whether it's the providers, the payers, life sciences, pharma, are ahead of anybody else with regard to business analytics? Is there one sector that could learn from another?
So each sector is further ahead in different areas. So what I was talking about earlier around the big data analytics to understand how to influence in behavior, the payers are way beyond where the providers are, right? But when you start talking about the genetic algorithms and analytics, the payers aren't doing anything anywhere close to that, right? It's the providers more so than anything that are really exploring the use of IBM Watson as an example. That's why MD Anderson did so much. I mean, I happen to know I used to work at IBM, and I was very involved in the early stages of trying to figure out how we were going to sell Watson to a wide range of industries. I'll say this anyways. I'm not sure if I'll just say it. I won't mention client names. There was a pharma client, and there was a payer client and a provider client. As you know, with MD Anderson, it was the provider client that really did a lot of work. Both the payer and the provider didn't go nearly as far because it was just pushing the envelope too much for them. So it was the provider in that case that was more interested. And so when you start to think of what's called cognitive computing and artificial intelligence, I think the providers are leading there. In the pharma space, when it comes to straight supply chain analytics, they're way out in the head. When it comes to, this is probably obvious, sales analytics, they're way out ahead. And when it comes to what I would say R&D analytics, so it's similar to the genetic, but the analytics that they're now using to really figure out which chemical compounds to invest in, they're pretty far ahead in a lot of cases. There's one solution out there that I've seen somebody working on where they actually are doing text analytics on every chemical patent filed in the Patent and Trade Offices over the last 20 years. And they were using that to run some algorithms to guide which chemicals they're going to focus their investment going forward. That's pretty advanced analytics.
It is.
I haven't personally done anything quite that complicated. So.
There's plenty of power behind the technology. We just have to find a good match. So I think this is a good time for me to open up to the audience. Yes, sir.
As a society, we have a great trust to our doctors. I tell her everything. So now there is data and analytics also in that exam room. Do you guys think that we should be able to trust that more or less or irrelevant? Trust the data and analytics in health.
Todd?
Trust in what sense?
So, for example, my diagnosis will involve a lot of data. Maybe a machine learning algorithm would suggest something. But currently, I have a great trust to the doctor. But now the doctor relies on data and algorithms that will guide for example, my treatment. So now I need to build a new trust to the person, I'm a data scientist, to the person who built the algorithm. So do you think this is complicated, or is it actually good for the society that we move towards data analytics?
Well, I think there's some complication because there's an enormous proliferation of data, right? And so what's a trusted source of information, not just a trusted source of data? So I think that's important. You've seen some of those cartoons when somebody goes to sit down with their doctor and they say, well, I'm here about my diagnosis, and they're Googling with the doctor sitting right beside them, right? So I don't think that's not a trusted source to go to the internet and just Google, because there's a lot of data out there that may not be particularly good information. So the interesting, I think down at the University of North Carolina, I think it was with Watson. I think it was Watson, or maybe it was Duke. That they actually, was it Duke?
Duke did a big Watson
But they did a
study.
big Watson, it was on a cancer diagnosis, is that correct? And so they went out and they used Watson to basically look at human learning, and machine learning. Was machine learning better than human learning? And they were very, very close, but Watson did have a better outcome because, it was marginal. In terms of, I guess, some information that they didn't.
And potential treatments, I think.
Right.
So I think Watson got them right. It's just they came up with some additional treatments that, by reading all of these studies, that they just had a wider array of data than the practitioners did.
Yeah. So data. I think the whole analytics and data information goes hand in hand with the clinician. Right, and the clinicians want to provide the best therapeutics, the best treatments to their patients. So I think they go hand in hand. I don't think it's mutually exclusive. I think it's inclusive, not exclusive. And again, they're trying to make good scientific decisions based on evidence, right? And so I think that's where the analytics can be very powerful.
Yeah, if I could just add, it's very hard for a doctor to actually read and understand the tens of thousands of medical journals that are issued every year. IBM Watson can actually do
Exactly.
that. IBM Watson can also actually immediately and instantly understand all of the diagnoses that have been entered into the system across a wide geography. And so the first application of Watson in the healthcare space was actually with WellPoint. I can't remember how many years ago. And it was basically to create a doctor assistant to, as they diagnosed, not to in real time doing it, but actually go back to a room, enter what they learned from that customer, and Watson would suggest. And I'll never forget the first example, the first demonstration that I saw was Lyme disease can be extremely hard to diagnose. And the example was, in this particular case, Watson found something faster than the doctor did because the doctor didn't know that in that one geographic area there was a high preponderance of Lyme disease in that area. And so there's a whole bunch of other. And so what Watson would do is not try to answer the question, but actually give a confidence rating for the top 10 diagnoses and then allow them to click on that and actually get the documentation underlying it. So I think where the trust, you should always trust your doctor, never trust a system. This isn't Minority Report or whatever the hell an example you want to use. But it can supplement and it can actually give access to the underlying information that gives more confidence in the result. Can you imagine if your doctor diagnosed you and immediately on a handheld clicked and said, here's the reasons why? And here's the other information. If they had access to that, that's going to give you more trust.
Right, and not only hear the reasons why, but on the click, hear the specific therapeutic or the evidence base around what type of treatment plan. That's the other part of it, right? You're looking for that too.
Yeah.
So before analytics was called analytics, it was called decision support systems. That's the old name. My mentor, who was one of the father figures of decision support systems, would always remind me that whenever you build systems, don't forget the middle S, support. These systems will change, but they are designed to support decision making, not replace decision making. So I hope that answers your question. Okay. Any other questions?
Chris, could you tell me about what you do to ensure that the raw data is clean and accurate in terms of building algorithms and models?
Yeah, so there's actually an art to that. You need to basically analyze the data for cleanliness. I'll just give you an example of something that happened this morning. We were trying to do some analysis on a particular market in the country for a payer, and we were actually doing something called agent-based simulation model to figure out if we can influence their use of coaching for chronic conditions. And so the first step was to say, is this market going to be okay for us to do this test here? So the first step was to say, how many people with chronic conditions are in that market? And so we had somebody do some analysis just to take the data set that we had to see what it was. And it was really lower than our expectations. And so we took a bunch of other studies and we just looked at the nation, how many people, what on average percentage of people that had chronic condition, and it was 3 times higher. That market, the data that we had, said that the number of chronic conditions was about 3 times lower than what we would expect. And we went back, and now you know something, you have an observation, and now you got to do the due diligence to figure out what caused that. So there is no way, you just got to roll up your sleeves and get in and start to really test that data and figure out if you can trust it before you start to try to answer the real question. And you've just got to have somebody who's got that expertise and the willingness to ask kind of those basic questions to figure out, does this data make sense? You have to test it against your intuition at some higher level. There's no other way to do it. I will say one other thing. Going on. There is an understanding of how the data is collected is also important. So we usually will start there. If it's a highly manual data collection process, we have a different set of assumptions than if it was highly automated. So that's another thing to think about.
Thank you. Other questions?
I was just interested, how much time is being spent focused on data for the consumer or trying to get the consumer to ask for the data? If they're the ones in the office, does that further the field because they're saying, I want the data? Because it sounded like it was pharma and healthcare and payers, so I just didn't know percentage-wise how much is consumer-based and trying to make analytics understandable to them.
Right now, my clients are not seeing a lot of consumer-driven analytics. They are seeing a little bit of consumer, well, I guess where the consumer interest is in being able to quickly understand exactly, say, if you're your insurer, exactly where you are in relation to your deductible. How do I track that? Like, those are a lot of questions. I think there's a lot of your customers that probably are very interested in some of the advanced analytics around genetics and sequencing and that, so there's some interest there. But a lot of the behavioral change stuff that we're starting to talk about that goes along with that, I haven't seen a lot of consumer demand for that yet. I don't know if you have.
Yeah, I mean, on the, certainly we see it on the interest. I mean, people that understand some of the things that are taking place, changes in healthcare today. I mean, people that want to have a lot more data about their health, and they want to have access to that data. They want to have a whole genome sequence. They want to have a pharmacogenomics test to understand, again, drug toxicity and dosing. They want the interpretation of that data, because I think that's interpretation is important. Because again, if you get a whole genome sequence, I mean, it's a big data field. You want the interpretation of that, not the data itself. So those intermediaries are very important, and we do see people now coming. They'll ask for that. That we want. We have history of breast cancer in our family. We want to have a genetic test to see if there's a BRCA1, BRCA2 genetic marker. So I think consumers are starting, but I still think it's pretty early. I think what Chris said earlier, one of the more interesting things is how do you get patients, consumers to actually take action. And we had some folks in from the Obama, what I call them, data analytics team, the 08-12 team, and they're trying to get people to identify people and then get them to take action. The action they were trying to get them to take was to actually vote. So one of the things we try to do, we may have great data and algorithms to be able to better predict, for example, which type of patients are likely to readmit, which is a big deal, readmissions in the healthcare space. But if we can't get them to do anything, to actually take action, to take their medications, to make sure their food, their diet is consistent with the way their drugs have been prescribed, to make sure they take their doctor visits and things like that, then it's kind of an category of interesting but not relevant. So how do we take the data to better predict and prevent around readmission, and then how do we use the analytics to try to intervene with those people and to get them to take specific actions? I mean, that to me it's tough, but it's important, and that's not the unicorn around genetics and genomics. That's fundamentally how do you use this to get people to take action?
Yeah, I'll add. I mean, I was thinking about if you listen to phone calls coming into the call centers for payers or even providers have call centers. I mean, where you'll get the biggest angst is if there is an expectation that the operator on the other side or the call center agent actually has access to all relevant healthcare information for that patient. And so that is driving a lot of investment on the data side to make sure that they do have access to that. And then on the data visualization side in a way that they can understand it and start to communicate. So that is one area certainly where these payers are feeling the heat from their customers.
Well, and I think the whole drive of consumerism along those lines, consumers are starting to demand more information about, say, specific providers if they need to have a particular procedure. They would like it to be more like Amazon, where they could go on and actually rate the providers and get quality ratings and be able to see more information about the providers to be able to make their decisions. I've even heard it taken a step farther. Well, then you get the diagnosis, and then you've got the person Googling WebMD and trying to figure out what the treatment plans are. And then the next step being some kind of clinical trials. And I hear a lot of complaints from consumers. There's not a lot of data on all these clinical trials that are out there, and even one of our entrepreneurial type clients is thinking along the lines of a Match.com for clinical trials. So I think the consumerism is hitting healthcare. It's slow, but it's creating a lot of demand for some of this information and ultimately maybe some of these analytics.
I just add, the clinical trials, again, you're seeing virtual clinical trials being created by patients. Right, they're not waiting for governmental sources and clinical trials, I guess it's .gov, but they're actually virtual clinical trials that are being created. I think the other point which was made, which is a great point, is that the healthcare industry, and we're part of that, much more transparency, and that's where I think analytics is also important around quality, around outcomes, around things like falls and sepsis and readmission. That's important, and also price. I mean, if you think about it, healthcare is the only industry in America where, and I've tried this experiment before, we ask how much something's going to cost, and you don't get a very good answer. And again, you're not, if you have a traumatic injury on the, driving on the Beltway tonight and you have to have brain surgery, you're not real concerned about how much something costs. But if you're going in for a fairly routine procedure and you call up a healthcare provider and say, well, how much is that going to cost? You get a funny answer. You might get an answer, well, it'll cost this much for the hospital, but you'll say, no, but I want the whole cost, the whole thing, not just a piece of it. You might get a funny answer. So again, I think that's an important part of transparency that needs to be provided, and I think analytics can help do that to give consumers, because consumers, as you know, I mean, big deductibles, big co-pays. I mean, I think they're getting much more sensitive to cost and price today than they have been, and they want that information.
I just want to add, I used to work for a provider. We had no clue how much it costs us. That's why we can't tell you. We'll make up a number.
You know what you charge for it, but not what it costs.
Absolutely.
No. What they know is what they know is, think about it, because in healthcare, it's all about reimbursement.
That's right.
And reimbursement is all very, very different, right? You negotiate a contract with Aetna, which is very different than Cigna, which is very different from Medicaid and Medicare. So but that's not right. That's not what you're looking for. How much does it cost?
Yeah, and that's the answer we used to get when we would ask people that we need to know how much it costs, because they said, we're going to get reimbursed what we get reimbursed, so why bother?
Right.
So, question.
Yeah, thank you for coming tonight. I was just curious about what size, how many millions of records do you run into? Because I find that running these algorithms on like 40 million lines of data it just takes a long time. I mean, we have private servers that have a hard time with 40 million servers, and we're a fairly large company. What size data do you run into? What kind of software do you use? And do you use products like Hadoop? Three-part question.
Yeah. I'm happy to take it if you want.
Yeah. I mean, I'll after you.
So 40 million records we deal with that all the time. You're obviously not going to do that on your laptop. So typically we will be running that on some servers, usually in HDFS, which is Hadoop. So more and more of our customers, if you're dealing with unstructured text, even voice analytics, so we're now analyzing actual voice recordings to try to gain insights. And so typically when you're doing the discovery analytics, you're gonna work with some serious technology and some serious servers, and you're probably going to have that data sitting in Hadoop someplace. Now, keep in mind, if you're analyzing big data on Hadoop, it's not necessarily the best way if you're trying to operationalize an algorithm, because it's not necessarily as fast. Hadoop is really good for when you have a lot of unstructured data and you're trying to do some discovery. It's really good for that. But if you're trying to run an algorithm off 40 million records and then feed a whole bunch of action items every night or every day, you're going to want to do that. You're going to translate that into a more structured system and how that's going to process. So that's really important. The one thing, you mentioned 40 million records. So the one thing for everyone should keep in mind, right? 40 million records refers to kind of the vertical dimension of your data set, how many records you have. Don't forget that a real big processor is the width, how many columns or how many variables you're talking about. So there are different analytical techniques that can be run faster to figure out which of the width variables are relevant, and you knock those out so that you can use all your records but focus it more. Well, and nobody should leave here. I'm never recommending that you just arbitrarily drop variables. You want to start your analysis with as many, a wide a data set of variables as you possibly can, and use some certain mathematical techniques to figure out how to systematically eliminate those that aren't as relevant.
I believe that would be the last question.
A quick question. This is actually addressed to all of you, because I think my question touches on everything that was touched upon so far. It strikes me that when we talk about analytics, our minds tend to wander toward big data, and in some ways it's almost trying to systematize the intuition of a doctor and all that other stuff. But it seems to be that the big force multiplier isn't big data, it's little data. Little data with big workflow. Because it's that lack of closure that's actually the way that I think that we can get to the efficiencies, the value-based efficiencies for value that Ann's talking about, the infrastructure substrates that Ed's talking about, and the personalized health that Todd's talking about and the analytics that Chris is talking about. So I'm kind of curious what your opinion is. If you had to weight it, is it 50-50, 80-20? Is it more about big data, or is it really about little data with an actual hard closed loop on the workflow?
I have some pretty strong opinions on that. So it is absolutely both, but you always should start looking at big data, because I'll give you a really good example. So I was just building a client retention model for a payer, and they wanted us to look at 150 variables because that's more like little data, so we can analyze that easier. And they didn't want me to use this external data set that was another 180 variables. So it didn't cost us anything, so we just used that external data anyways. Of the 320 variables that we looked at to predict clients who were likely to leave, 20 of them were highly correlated with retention. And of those 20, 12 are the external data source. So if you have a mindset where before you do the analysis, you're looking for little data, you're going to miss potentially a big part of the data that influences. And so I try to change the discussion so that start with big data, eventually to drive decisions in an operational way, you are going to get it down to little data, but never be myopic in your focus on little data. It's absolutely true, exactly what you said. The value is when you get to the little data, absolutely. Mm-hmm. But you got to start with the bigger data so you don't lose key insights.
Okay, one more question.
How do you bargain for that?
As I've been thinking about this on the security side, I have a kind of a question, a wrinkle maybe, and maybe we start with Ann. You know, if you steal my bank account information, or you steal my credit card information, when I close those, I get new ones. But if you steal my medical data, you've stolen me in some fundamental way. So it seems to me there's a big issue in security, cyber in the healthcare arena is going to default to liability fundamentally, because these things cannot be fixed, and I mean how does that enter in? How do those kinds of decisions enter?
You mean who's liable?
Yeah, because if you steal my bank account information, or you steal my credit card information, I close that down and get new ones, and when we get beyond that. But if you've stolen my medical information, you've stolen me. So the liability issue has got to really come in here in a very important way, it seems.
Absolutely. I mean, and we've had clients that have experienced that medical identity theft, where Northwestern Hospital experienced that with a person stealing someone else's identity and then experienced almost $1 million worth of care before the hospital realized it, and then the hospital was liable for that, even though it was fraud inherent in that transaction. With regard to the breach of if it's a hospital-owned system, and you guys weigh in to jump in if you disagree or even to augment. I mean, the hospital, we got into this discussion earlier, the hospital kind of owns that data. So then the hospital ultimately becomes liable if it happens to get breached. But I mean, you're exactly right. It's a bigger identity type of theft than just financial data. And it could include financial data too, because in addition to all the medical data, the hospital has your financial data too, because most of the time you're paying online or with credit cards. So it's just a bigger combination of data that can potentially be stolen from you. I don't know what the answer is in terms of how do what happens if somebody steals your identity. I guess you go through the same processes of having your financial data breached and getting new cards and letting your insurance company know that.
But I guess it just seems like the data breach is more important there, and so I'm going to be more concerned about ultimately holding someone liable for that.
Well, we had an internal audit compliance roundtable recently, and that topic came up. So we had about 10 providers represented and these compliance officers, and they got into a discussion of how do you discipline employees when you have a data breach or identity theft. And a lot of this had to do with either celebrity data being breached. I mean, just like the princess's baby or being born or some other type of breach like that. And it was funny because about half of them said we would instantly terminate the employee if it was an employee error, and a lot of times it is. As we all talked about, this is very labor intensive, so it's data in from real hands, real people. The other half said, we have some disciplinary measures we use when there's a data breach that involves our employees. But the fact that half of them would terminate an employee instantly for a data breach just, to me, signals how important keeping that data private is on the part of the providers, and because of their liability as well as their reputations.
So I want to follow up on Dean Pulley's question. Anybody who's had identity theft or even credit card number theft knows that even after it's discovered, people have horror stories about taking 6 months to a year to clean up their record, if at all. Do we know of healthcare identity thefts and how long it took for people to clean up that? And what happened if in between they needed services? Do we have any examples of that?
Nobody wants to admit it.
Well, so on two of the major data breaches, we have at EY, we have a fraud and investigative dispute services group. And so on two of the major thefts that happened for payers in this country, we were the first people on the ground to diagnose what happened. I am not aware of the same, if you think of Target and what they had to do for those individual people in those programs, I'm not aware that the same thing happened on the healthcare side. In other words, the people whose data was taken, they didn't have an immediate issue, like a painful issue right away. So there was not, to my knowledge, a program like what Target did, which for some of their customers, they give you additional LifeLock
2 years,
or whatever. Yeah. Actually, I think it was actually the Office of Management Budget that actually was giving free identity protection services to people.
Yeah.
So I'm not aware that the same thing happened in the two major healthcare payer.
Was that because they didn't perceive that it was as a big of an issue, or just that they didn't think that the data breach would necessarily cause harm to the people, because then they could prevent whatever the ramification might be?
That's right.
That makes sense.
So we are out of regulation time, but if there is interest, we will go over time. Any questions? Yeah.
Got one in the back.
While we are getting ready for this question here, if you have questions and you want to write them on your card, put your email address and your name on it too. We will try to get you the answer and email it back to you. Of course, during the reception, we'll be available, so you can ask questions of the panelists.
So this can be kind of a fun question. I know most people here are probably focused on big data, macro level, but I'm interested in possibly what each of you are doing individually to use your own data and analytics to be more healthy and proactive and predictive in your own diagnosis of health.
Well, my watch just told me to stand up, so there you go, right there. Breathe. It says breathe and stand up, yeah.
Who's going to be the first?
I'll make one comment on that. I think, again, 10,000 steps, try and work out every day, eat reasonably well. I think just being exposed to this topic of healthcare every day sort of changes a bit of the way you think about your own health. But also, I think it gets back a little bit to the use of analytics for the consumers. I think at some level, maybe it's a fairly simple level, but every time you sign up for your benefit program on an annual basis provided by your employer, I bet all of you now have the opportunity to get a discount on your insurance if you do the following 5 things, or you certify that you do the following 5 things. I'm assuming that that's based on some form of analytics that the payers have done, maybe relatively simple. But I think this is all getting driven down to the consumer, sometimes without a lot of conscious thought on our part. If I can save $50 a month by losing 10 pounds, I think I might do that.
Yeah. And I joked about standing up, but I do. The health data, in terms of workout and things like that, I'm on a daily basis, and you kind of get to the end of the day, I'm looking at steps, and so I got a few more to do. So that's certainly, on a more significant aspect, the Pharmacogenomics Test, this is something that we did I did here, because our team, the Innova Translational Medicine, our genomics lab does these. This was an 18-gene, 118-drug test, statins, cardiovascular drugs, and psychotropic drugs. And when I had my report that was done that I could then take to my primary care physician and go through it, my son has my genes and my wife's genes. And the report I got, it showed high sensitivity to a certain psychotropic drug, which he in fact was taking. And immediately, upon delivering that report for his physician to see it, they took him off that drug. And they moved him to a different drug. And after he was moved to a different drug, he said, you know, that was having some interesting side effects on me. It didn't feel good. And the problem with that, when you have side effects with a psychotropic drug, you stop taking the drug. And so that had an immediate impact, again, through analytics, the data, the information, running a sequence, and the ability to do this, big data, because this is big data when you run a sequence. And right away took him off a drug and went on a different drug and a much better drug. So it has, you know, the small data, right, what's on my watch and what it tells me to do from an exercise, the big data, he's no longer taking a drug that he probably shouldn't have been taking in the first place.
Yeah. So this is sorry.
I was just going to answer it. Because I'm a bean counter, so I always feel like you can't manage what you can't measure. So same with Fitbits and measuring that. And then I have a Garmin watch where I'm a runner, so I measure calories burned, average length of run. It uploads to a computer, and I watch my average length of run, which, by the way, over the last 10 years has gone like this. But that's another story. And then the last thing is an app called Lose It. And so if you put in your food that you eat every day, and I do this, it'll tell you your cholesterol, your sodium, it'll tell you your calories, and it also tracks it, so you see a weekly chart. And just taking care of your own health in those ways to be able to monitor that. And I think eventually the providers will be able to link into these tools, and when we can get the full connectivity of all of this, I think that's when we can really manage population health a lot better.
So this is a very exciting time for all of us as healthcare consumers. And this is a special time because what we are hearing about healthcare analytics is because of the confluence of 2 or 3 different things that have happened. And if either of them did not happen, we wouldn't be here today. And those things are high-powered tools to analyze data that is generated by a lot of devices, what we call big data, and also computing power that is available on our watches, on our small devices. So all of these technologies have come together and led to this revolution that we are in the first inning, as Todd said, and there's a lot more to come. So thank you for being here. Liza is going to collect all the cards with your questions and your email address and name on it. Enjoy the reception.